Sometimes there are events in life that make a person radically change his worldview. So it happened to me. My name is Evgeny, I am 34 years old, but my head is already decorated with strands of gray hair. And all because just 2 years ago I came across something that I didn't even know existed. All my life I have been a staunch atheist and have always ignored everything connected with mysticism. Perhaps this is partly due to the fact that I lost both my parents as a child. They were not saved by any prayers and requests to the Lord. Literally by the age of 25, I had achieved some success at work and decided to purchase a private house. A suitable house was found near Tomsk in a cozy village. I was specifically looking for a small village because I wanted to live in a quiet environment away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The deal went quickly, and I became the happy owner of a cozy house in which I lived a happy 7 years of life. One morning, waking up from the noise of construction equipment, I looked out the window and saw a bulldozer that was cleaning a neighbor's plot. By the way, I had good relations with the locals, and I myself became a local, so I was extremely surprised while the neighbors on the site were doing who knows what. Meanwhile, a drilling rig drove into the site and began to bite into the ground. As it turned out, my neighbors decided to drill their own well in order not to pay for water. When the work was finished, I visited my neighbor with a bottle of white in order to find out how much he drilled the water for and, so to speak, take the first samples. We had a drink or two and went to the well, in place of which there was now a freshly installed well. Near the well, in the piles of excavated earth, something was white. Looking closer, I realized that it was someone's bones that the drilling rig had dug out of the ground. A neighbor calmed me down, explaining that these were cow bones, because once in Soviet times there was a farm here. I calmed down. While talking and drinking, we did not notice how the hands of the clock approached midnight, and, catching myself, I went home. In the morning, my head was cracking terribly, and when I went out on the porch, I noticed some kind of meeting near the gate of a neighbor's house. As it turned out, the neighbor disappeared at night along with his whole family. The doors in the house are wide open, there are no signs of a struggle, as if they got up and went somewhere unknown. Since that day, the quiet life in our village has ended. The neighbor and his family did not return either for lunch or the next day, and his well was immediately privatized by the locals, who were very happy to collect water in it. And especially enterprising, even managed to conduct water from the well to the site. On the morning of the next day, it turned out that another family had disappeared. The circumstances were the same. The family was safe and disappeared again without a trace. The locals began to sound the alarm. There were suspicions that a maniac or even a whole gang of cannibals was operating in the district. Adults stopped letting their children out after sunset, and they themselves tried not to leave their homes. However, this did not stop the series of disappearances, and the district police officer just threw up his hands, saying, "Well, what can I do?" On the morning of the next day, horror went through the village, quietly covering every house and crawling into the soul of every inhabitant. In one night, 4 houses in different parts of the village were emptied at once. People began to massively barricade and strengthen houses, and those who had weapons equipped firing points. The village went into a state of siege. As for the poor precinct officer, he was almost quartered. He was hiding behind the fact that he was waiting for approval to initiate a criminal case from the district center. They say there is no corpus delicti. Although the people were not particularly reassured. Days went by, but no matter what measures we took, in the morning it turned out that another house was empty again during the night, and sometimes more than one. By the end of the month, only 3 residential buildings remained in the village, one of which was mine. Communication and cable internet disappeared. There was also no transport connection with the city. And so, on another day, when the sun dipped to the horizon, and the night gradually came into its rightful rights, plunging the almost empty village into darkness, somewhere on the outskirts of the settlement, there was a man's scream and a shot from a hunting rifle. A second and everything went quiet. I assumed that most likely another house would be empty in the morning, when suddenly, somewhere behind the fence of my plot, there was a crunch of branches. I hid myself by closing the shutters and went up to the attic, dragging the ladder after me. Through small attic window, I could see my entire plot at a glance, so after reloading a gun borrowed from one of the deserted houses, I began to observe. The crunch of branches was replaced by the sound of footsteps on the rubble in front of the house, and so for about 2 hours. Then, a hand reached over the gate and reached for the bolt. The metal pin fell to the ground, and the gate swung open. A male figure entered the plot, and to my horror, I recognized her. In the light of the moon, a neighbor was standing on my lawn, the one who disappeared first. That's just how strange he looked. The skin is very pale, covered in some kind of dirt, the eyes sparkle like two LEDs. And there was something strange and inhuman about the gate. When the neighbor began to approach the house, I noticed that he was moving like a doll on hinges. There was no plastic and no human tread. Hell, he wasn't human. The neighbor approached the house, disappearing from my field of vision, when suddenly, about a minute later, the house was shaken by a strong blow, and something heavy fell to the floor with a loud sound. Apparently, it was the front door, which my neighbor literally took out. Footsteps and raucous breathing sounded from below. This something was looking for me. It searched the house, knocked down the doors, but still could not find me. It was nearing dawn when the creature finally remembered about the attic and apparently, not finding the stairs, decided to climb the wall, but as soon as the first rays of the morning sun peeked out from behind the horizon, the creature instantly left the house and literally disappeared. It was only by lunchtime that I dared to get down from my hiding place and, driving the trunk around the yard, looked around. A little emboldened, I walked through the village, hoping to find survivors. However, after wandering around for about 3 hours, I realized that I was left alone. Yes, I was the last living person in this village. You may ask why I didn't leave as soon as this whole mess started. So I had nowhere to go. I have no relatives, no friends as such either, so I had to stay in the village. However, then, left completely alone, I still decided to leave the village. After loading everything I needed into the car, I noticed a puddle spread out under it. Looking under the car, I was dumbfounded. The brake lines were torn off, and the engine tray was literally split in half, as if it had been hit with a hammer. I went through the village in search of another escape vehicle. After that, the whole day passed, as a result of which I found an oldie's motorcycle, which I tried to start, but apparently he had problems with the carburetor, so I dragged him to my site. I started setting it up, and then covered the equipment with rags, so that the motorcycle would not catch my eye, and climbed back into the attic, for the day was already drawing to a close. They appeared quietly as soon as the time passed 10 o'clock in the evening. Gradually, I began to notice the figures that walked around my site. Every minute there were more and more of them, and when I looked at the faces in more detail, I realized that they were all my missing neighbors. All the villagers looked equally pale, and they were all standing on my plot. Among them was a local policeman with several policemen. Apparently, this was the task force, which simply did not reach our village. The strange procession stood in the courtyard until midnight. No one made a sound and no one moved, as if it were wax figures occupying my entire plot. But as soon as the clock struck 12, real devilry began to happen on the site. All the figures moved at the same time, rushing towards the house. The whole house was shaking, something was constantly cracking and breaking. Through the attic window I saw the creatures rush to the cellar, which stood in the distance. There was another crack, and I noticed how one of the creatures, without making any effort, pulled out the door to the cellar along with the jam. Fear began to slowly bind my body, although I hoped that the creatures would forget about my existence and just leave. But then something happened that made my soul almost leave my body. There was a blow in the hatch cover to the attic, from which she jumped and fell back with a crash. Damn, the creatures still found my hiding place, I realized in horror. One by one, heavy blows fell on the hatch cover. Apparently, the creatures have created something like a living ladder. And so, at one point, the lid jumped up again, and this time flew sideways. And from below came the vile whisper of dozens of voices. "You have disturbed us. You have been drinking from our graves. You will pay for it." At that moment, I was completely confused and believed that I was going crazy. All this passed for some kind of mystical insanity. But then, a pale hand grabbed the edge of the manhole, the boards cracked, and I realized that I could not interfere anymore. I had to run. Swinging, I hit the window with all my might with the butt of the gun. Something crumbled into the street. After the second blow, the frame flew out. Preparing to jump, I turned around and saw several silhouettes that had almost climbed into the attic. It was impossible to delay any longer. I jumped down. Fortunately, the height was small, so I didn't damage anything. The gun fell a meter away from me, and as soon as I picked it up, one of my neighbors ran out at me from the basement, or rather, something resembling it. The shot and his head shattered, turning into a bloody mess. I ran as fast as I could to the hidden garage, throwing the double-barreled shotgun aside. Behind him, there was the sound of many feet and a nasty hissing whisper. Jumping on the motorcycle, I tried to start it with a Kickstarter, praying that the engine would not fail, and to my happiness, I heard the measured rumble of the two-stroke engine. There was no time to warm up the engine, and having stuck the first gear in, I turned the throttle, and the motorcycle jerked forward briskly. Jumping out of the yard, I began to pick up speed, but the vile whisper still did not go away. Looking back, I almost gave my soul to God. The creatures that were once my neighbors were now rushing after a motorcycle, flying at full speed on their feet and not really lagging behind. A turn appeared ahead, and I had to slow down a little, and at that moment, one of the creatures, taking advantage of the situation, jumped and grabbed the red-hot muffler, but as it seemed to me, it did not feel pain, and the muffler only crumpled under the powerful grip of the creature. However, the turn ended, and once again opening the gas, I threw the pursuer off the tail. I don't remember how I got to the city, and how I was looking for the way to the police. As the duty officer told me later, the traffic police crew caught up with me as I was winding through the streets of the night city, and took me to the police station. I came to myself only after a glass of cognac, which one of the inspectors kindly poured me. As soon as I told them everything that had happened to me, even experienced employees doubted and almost called a mental hospital. But apparently there was still something in my story that could convince them, and after making a request to the Paradise Department, the elderly psychic thoughtfully said that the group sent to my village really has not been in touch for several days. The security guards contacted the management and explained the situation. A command was immediately given to assemble personnel, and an oppo group with powerful fire support was ordered to be sent to my village. I was asked to attend as a witness. It took the police about 3 hours to gather and coordinate, and so, around 5 a.m. we arrived in the village. At first glance, it was completely empty, and having stopped the cars on the outskirts, the police began to comb the whole village in a chain. After another hour, I was invited to a conversation with the senior of the group, during which he told me that all my fellow villagers were in their homes, but they had been dead for several days. The corpses were in a variety of poses, as if they had all died in an instant. However, there was still one significant oddity. Many of the prematurely deceased had fresh earth on their feet, as if they were literally walking down the street 20 minutes ago. The village was cordoned off, and no one had a logical explanation for what happened. As it turned out later, bones were found near the very well that my neighbor dug. Exactly the ones that the neighbor identified as animal bones. As a result, they turned out to be human, and judging by their age, they were very many years old. The senior of the group, who turned out to be a native Siberian, took me aside and quietly said, "I know what I'm talking about. In my homeland, it is customary to honor the memory of our ancestors. Your neighbor disturbed an ancient burial, and your whole village began to drink water from the graves, for which it paid. The dead don't like to be disturbed by the living. Many months have passed since the moment when I encountered something not from our world. But since then I have come to believe in mysticism and in God and in the devil. Of course, I changed my place of residence. I moved to a high-rise building in the city. But I'm still afraid one day to see pale faces and burning eyes of people passing by on the street."